George Strait is surprised by a fan's tribute during a medical appointment. What he did next moved everyone to tears. The fluorescent lights of Memorial Hospital in San Antonio cast harsh shadows across Dr. Michael Ramirez's face as he stared at the letter that would change everything. His hands trembled slightly as he read the words that spelled the end of his life's work. Due to budget constraints, the Pediatric Oncology Assistance Program will be terminated effective immediately. 26 children. 26 innocent souls who depended on his program for their cancer treatment were about to lose their only hope because some administrator in a suit had decided their lives weren't worth the expense. Dr. Ramirez had seen death before. In his 15 years as an oncologist, he had witnessed countless battles between life and the merciless disease that consumed his patients from within. But this letter represented something far worse than death. It represented the deliberate abandonment of hope for families who had already lost everything except their faith in his program. The 42-year-old doctor closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the moment that had shaped his entire existence. He was 16 again, sitting on the edge of Highway 91 outside his hometown of Pearsall, Texas, with tears streaming down his face and his father's drunken screams still echoing in his ears. The old transistor radio in his beaten-up Ford truck had been playing country music, and then George Strait's voice had filled the humid Texas air with "I Cross My Heart." Something about that song, about the promise of better days, and the power of unwavering commitment had pulled him back from the edge of a darkness he had never spoken about to another living soul. That night had changed everything. The scared, broken teenager had made a promise to himself that he would dedicate his life to saving others, the same way that song had saved him. Now, 26 years later, he was about to watch his dream crumble because of money, the very thing that had never mattered to him. But before we continue with this incredible story of faith, music, and miracles, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this tale and want to see how Dr. Ramirez's world is about to collide with country music royalty in the most unexpected way, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a song change your life? And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from, because stories like this one connect hearts across the world. Dr. Ramirez pushed back from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the hospital's children's wing. Below, he could see Maria Santos, 8 years old, playing with her stuffed elephant while her mother sat beside her, reading a book. Maria had been diagnosed with leukemia 3 months ago, and her family had traveled from Mexico with nothing but hope and the clothes on their backs. Without his program, Maria would return to Mexico untreated, and Dr. Ramirez knew exactly what that meant. "Knock, knock!" The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Williams, his colleague and the closest thing he had to a friend in the sterile world of hospital politics. She entered his office with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had heard the news. "So, you heard about the program?" Dr. Ramirez said, not bothering to look away from the window. "The whole hospital heard about it, Michael, and they also heard about what you said to Administrator Phillips in the meeting." Patricia set down the coffee and crossed her arms, calling him a heartless bureaucrat who wouldn't recognize human decency. If it performed surgery on his wallet, might not have been your smartest career move. Dr. Ramirez finally turned around, his dark eyes flashing with the same fire that had carried him through medical school on nothing but determination and student loans. "You know what, Patricia? I've spent 15 years watching administrators like Phillips make decisions about life and death from behind their mahogany desks. They've never held a child's hand while explaining why chemotherapy is going to make them sick. They've never had to look into a mother's eyes and tell her that her baby's only chance at survival is a treatment her insurance won't cover. No, Michael, I know." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. "But burning bridges won't save those kids. You need to find another way." Dr. Ramirez laughed bitterly. "Another way? I've already tried everything. Private donors, grant applications, fundraising events. The truth is, people don't want to think about children with cancer. It's too real, too heartbreaking. They'd rather write a check to save the whales or preserve some historic building." What Dr. Ramirez didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, his carefully controlled world would be turned upside down by the most unlikely of encounters. The appointment scheduled for 9:30 the next morning would bring him face to face with the very man whose voice had saved his life all those years ago. And that meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform his struggling program, but would create a miracle that would touch hearts across the entire nation. But before that miracle could unfold, Dr. Ramirez would have to endure one more humiliation. Administrator Phillips had called an emergency meeting for 8 o'clock that evening, and the entire medical staff knew it was going to be a public execution. Phillips had been waiting for an excuse to shut down the Pediatric Oncology Assistance Program for months, and Dr. Ramirez's outburst had given him all the ammunition he needed. The conference room was packed when Dr. Ramirez arrived. Phillips stood at the head of the table like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a closing argument. He was a thin, sharp-faced man in his 50s who had never practiced medicine but had built his career on cost-cutting and efficiency reports. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss the future of Dr. Ramirez's project." Phillips spoke the word project like it was something distasteful. "As you all know, this hospital operates on a strict budget, and we simply cannot continue to subsidize treatments for patients who cannot pay their bills." Dr. Ramirez felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest. "Those patients are children, Mr. Phillips, children who will die without treatment. Children who are not our responsibility," Phillips shot back. "This is a business, Dr. Ramirez, not a charity. Perhaps if you had chosen a more profitable specialty, you'd understand the financial realities we face." The room fell silent. Dr. Ramirez slowly stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, he looked like that 16-year-old boy again, pushed to his breaking point by another man's cruelty. "You're right, Mr. Phillips. This is a business, and my business is saving lives. Your business seems to be counting money while children die in the rooms downstairs." His voice was steady, but everyone in the room could feel the emotion burning just beneath the surface. "But I'll tell you what. Tomorrow, I have a consultation with a patient who might teach you something about the value of human decency. Someone who understands that some things matter more than profit margins." Phillips smiled coldly. "And who might that be, Doctor?" "Someone who proves that real success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the hope you give to others." Dr. Ramirez walked out of the conference room with his head high, but his heart was breaking. He had no idea that his mysterious patient for the next morning would indeed prove his point in ways he couldn't even imagine. George Strait, the king of country music, was about to walk into his examination room, and with him would come a story that would change everything. As Dr. Ramirez drove home through the quiet streets of San Antonio, he couldn't have known that hundreds of miles away, George Strait was reviewing his appointment schedule and thinking about the routine medical checkup he had scheduled for the next morning. The legendary singer had been dealing with some minor health concerns that came with being 73 years old, but he had learned to keep his medical issues private. The last thing he wanted was for his fans to worry about his health. But George Strait had no idea that his appointment with Dr. Ramirez would become one of the most important moments of his 5-decade career. He couldn't have known that his music had literally saved the life of the doctor who would be examining him, or that his visit would set in motion a series of events that would touch the lives of countless children and families across the nation. As both men prepared for sleep that night, neither could have imagined that their paths were about to cross in a way that would prove, once and for all, that some encounters are simply meant to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as George Strait stepped out of his black pickup truck. At 73, the king of country music still moved with the confident stride of a man who had commanded stages across the world, but today he felt every one of his years. The routine medical appointments had become more frequent lately, and while he never complained publicly, the weight of time was something even his legendary voice couldn't sing away. Dr. Michael Ramirez arrived at the hospital an hour early, as he always did. The confrontation with Administrator Phillips the night before had left him with little sleep, but his professional demeanor remained intact. He had reviewed his patient files for the morning, noting that his 9:30 appointment was listed simply as George S., a common practice for high-profile patients who valued their privacy. As he walked through the children's wing, Dr. Ramirez stopped by Maria Santos's room. The 8-year-old girl was awake, playing quietly with her stuffed elephant, while her mother slept in the chair beside her bed. Maria looked up and smiled when she saw him, her face pale, but her eyes still bright, with the resilience that never failed to amaze him. "Buenos dias, Dr. Ramirez," Maria whispered, careful not to wake her mother. "Are you going to make me better today?" The question hit him like a physical blow. How could he tell this brave little girl that her treatments might stop? How could he explain that her life was being measured against budget spreadsheets and profit margins? "I'm going to try my very best, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you that." But as he walked away from her room, Dr. Ramirez wondered if his promises meant anything anymore. In just a few hours, he would have to start making phone calls to families, explaining that their children's treatments were being discontinued. The thought made his stomach turn. At exactly 9:30, there was a knock on his office door. Dr. Ramirez looked up from his charts and called out, "Come in." The door opened and time seemed to stop. George Strait stepped into the room, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his famous cowboy hat in his hand. For a moment, Dr. Ramirez forgot how to breathe. The man whose voice had literally saved his life was standing in his office, looking exactly like the pictures he had seen countless times, but somehow more real, more human. "Dr. Ramirez? I'm George Strait. I believe we have an appointment." The doctor managed to find his voice. "Yes, sir. Please, have a seat." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, his mind racing. Of all the days for this to happen, why did it have to be today? Why did the universe have to play such a cruel joke on him? George settled into the chair and placed his hat on his knee. "I appreciate you fitting me into your schedule, Doc. No, you must be busy." "Not at all, Mr. Strait. It's an honor to have you here." Dr. Ramirez opened George's file, trying to focus on the medical information rather than the surreal nature of the situation. "I've reviewed your recent test results, and I'm happy to report that everything looks good. Your blood work is excellent for someone your age, and your previous scans show no areas of concern." George smiled. "Well, that's a relief. At my age, you never know what these checkups might reveal." Dr. Ramirez conducted the examination with professional efficiency, checking George's blood pressure, listening to his heart, and asking the standard questions about his health. But throughout the process, he found himself stealing glances at the man who had unknowingly saved his life. The internal battle between maintaining his professional composure and sharing his personal story was tearing him apart. "Everything looks perfect, Mr. Strait," Dr. Ramirez said as he finished the examination. "I'd recommend continuing with your current health routine and coming back in 6 months for another checkup." George stood up and reached for his hat. "Thank you, Doc. I appreciate your thoroughness." This was it. George Strait was about to walk out of his life forever, and Dr. Ramirez would never get another chance to tell him what his music had meant. The weight of the moment, combined with the stress of losing his program, finally broke through his professional barriers. "Mr. Strait, before you go, there's something I need to tell you." George paused, his hand on the door handle. "What's that, Doc?" Dr. Ramirez took a deep breath. "In normal circumstances, I would never mix my personal life with my professional duties. But these aren't normal circumstances, and I may never get another chance to say this." The country music legend turned around, his expression curious but patient. "Your music saved my life," Dr. Ramirez said, his voice barely above a whisper. George's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I'm sorry?" 26 years ago, I was 16 years old, sitting on the side of Highway 91 outside Pearsall, Texas. I had just run away from home after another violent fight with my alcoholic father. I was planning to end my life that night. The room fell silent. George slowly walked back to his chair and sat down, his full attention focused on the doctor. "I had it all planned out," Dr. Ramirez continued, his hands trembling slightly. "I was going to drive my truck into the overpass, but before I could do it, your song came on the radio. I crossed my heart. Something about that song, about the promise in your voice, about the hope. It made me cry for the first time in years. It made me believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth living for." George's eyes were wide with shock and emotion. "Son, that night, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would make something meaningful out of my life. I would help people the way your music helped me. I studied harder than I ever thought possible, earned scholarships, put myself through medical school, and became an oncologist. Every day for the past 15 years, I've been trying to save lives because you saved mine." The silence in the room was deafening. George Strait, who had heard countless stories from fans over the years, found himself speechless. This wasn't just another fan encounter. This was something profound, something that connected directly to the very heart of why he had become a musician in the first place. "I never knew," George said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I never knew that song could mean so much to someone." "It means everything to me," Dr. Ramirez said. "And now, ironically, on the same day I get to meet you, I'm about to lose the very thing that gave my life purpose." George leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Dr. Ramirez explained about his pediatric oncology assistance program, about the 26 children who would lose their treatments, about Administrator Phillips and the budget cuts. He told George about Maria Santos and the other families who had traveled from across the country and even from Mexico, seeking help for their children. "These kids don't have insurance that covers their treatments," Dr. Ramirez said. "Their families have sold everything they own just to get here. The program I created was their only hope, and now it's being shut down because it's not profitable enough." George listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. When Dr. Ramirez finished speaking, the country music legend sat in silence for a long moment. "How much money would it take to save the program?" George asked quietly. "About $200,000 annually," Dr. Ramirez replied. "It's not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, but for a hospital that's focused on profit margins." George stood up and extended his hand. "Dr. Ramirez, thank you for sharing your story with me, and thank you for dedicating your life to helping others." They shook hands, and Dr. Ramirez felt a strange sense of closure. At least he had been able to tell George Strait what his music had meant to him. Even if nothing else came of it, that moment was worth everything. After George left, Dr. Ramirez sat alone in his office, staring at the door through which his hero had just walked. He had no idea that George Strait had not gone home. Instead, the country music legend had driven to a quiet spot outside the hospital and was making phone calls to his management team, his lawyers, and his accountant. What Dr. Ramirez also didn't know was that George Strait had spent the past hour researching everything he could find about the Pediatric Oncology Assistance Program. He had called contacts at other hospitals, spoken to medical professionals, and even had his team investigate Administrator Phillips' background. What George discovered made his blood boil. Phillips had been systematically cutting funding to programs that served underprivileged patients while giving himself and other administrators substantial raises. The man was more concerned with his own financial gain than with the lives of the children in his hospital. But George Strait hadn't become a legend by backing down from fights that mattered. And this fight mattered more than any he had ever faced. The doctor who had dedicated his life to helping others because of a song George had sung decades ago was about to lose everything. And George wasn't going to let that happen. What George discovered about Administrator Phillips during his investigation was even worse than he had imagined. The man had been systematically destroying programs that served the most vulnerable patients while padding his own salary and benefits package. Phillips had a history of moving from hospital to hospital, cutting costs ruthlessly, collecting bonuses for his efficiency, and then moving on before the human consequences of his decisions became apparent. But this time, Phillips had picked the wrong program to eliminate. He had unknowingly targeted a doctor whose life's work was directly connected to one of the most beloved figures in American music. And George Strait was about to use every ounce of his influence, every connection he had built over 5 decades in the music industry to make sure that Phillips's reign of terror came to an end. As George sat in his truck outside the hospital, making call after call, he began to formulate a plan that was audacious even by his standards. He wasn't just going to save Dr. Ramirez's program, he was going to do it in a way that would send a message to every Administrator Phillips in every hospital across the country. He was going to prove that when people with power and influence choose to use those gifts for good, miracles can happen. The first call he made was to his longtime manager, who had been with him through every major decision of his career. The second call was to his attorney, who specialized in charitable giving and foundation work. The third call was to someone very few people knew George Strait had any connection to, a private investigator who had helped him with some sensitive family matters years earlier. As the sun set over San Antonio, George Strait was already putting together a plan that would not only save Dr. Ramirez's program, but would create a moment of magic that would touch hearts across the entire nation. The king of country music was about to show Administrator Phillips and the world what real success looked like. And what Dr. Ramirez didn't know was that George had already discovered something about his past that would make their next encounter even more emotional than their first. Something that would change both their lives forever in ways neither could have imagined. 3 days had passed since the life-changing encounter in Dr. Ramirez's office, and George Strait had been busier than he had been in years. His home office in San Antonio looked like a war room, with papers scattered across every surface, his phone ringing constantly, and his computer screen displaying multiple browser tabs with information about pediatric oncology programs, hospital administrators, and private investigation reports. The private investigator George had hired, Jake Morrison, was a former FBI agent who specialized in background checks and finding people who didn't want to be found. Jake had worked with George on some sensitive family matters years earlier, and the country music legend trusted him implicitly. What Jake had discovered about Dr. Michael Ramirez's past was both heartbreaking and potentially miraculous. "George, you need to sit down for this," Jake said over the phone, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen it all but was still moved by what he had uncovered. I've been investigating the Ramirez family for the past 72 hours, and what I found is going to change everything. George settled into his leather chair, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Tell me. Dr. Ramirez wasn't the only child who suffered in that household. He had a younger sister, Sophia, who was only 12 when he ran away from home. According to the police reports I found, she was taken into protective custody 2 weeks after Michael left. The abuse got worse after he was gone. Apparently their father focused all his rage on her. George's grip tightened on his coffee mug. What happened to her? She went into the foster care system, changed her name when she turned 18 to distance herself from her past. She's been looking for her brother for over 20 years, George. She hired private investigators, searched social media, even hired a genealogist to trace the family tree. But Michael changed his first name from Miguel to Michael when he got his scholarship to college, and he's been using his mother's maiden name, Ramirez, instead of his father's name, Hernandez. The silence on the phone was deafening. George felt his heart racing as he processed the information. Where is she now? That's the beautiful part of this story, George. She lives in Houston. She's married, has 2 kids, and works as a social worker helping children who have been through similar trauma. She never gave up hope of finding her brother. I have her contact information, but I wanted to check with you first before reaching out. George closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The pieces of his plan were falling into place in ways he couldn't have imagined. Jake, I need you to approach this very carefully. I don't want to get her hopes up if this doesn't work out the way I'm planning. What exactly are you planning, George? Something that's going to show the world what real success looks like. While Jake continued his investigation, George had been working on the other aspects of his plan. His manager, Tom Rodriguez, had, initially, thought George had lost his mind when he called him at midnight 3 days earlier, talking about organizing a surprise concert at a hospital to save a children's cancer program. George, you haven't performed in a venue smaller than an arena in 30 years, Tom had said, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. Why would you want to play for 200 people in a hospital auditorium? Because sometimes the most important audiences are the smallest ones, Tom. This isn't about ticket sales or chart positions. This is about something much bigger than that. Tom had learned over the years not to question George's instincts, especially when it came to matters of the heart. By the next morning, he had contacted the hospital's administration, obtained permission to use the auditorium, and begun coordinating with George's sound crew to set up equipment that would work in the intimate space. The hardest part had been keeping the concert a secret from Dr. Ramirez. George had spoken directly with the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had been moved to tears when George explained the situation. Dr. Chen had been fighting Administrator Phillips' budget cuts for months, and she saw George's intervention as a gift from heaven. Dr. Ramirez is going to be devastated when he has to tell those families that their children's treatments are being discontinued, Dr. Chen had told George during their private meeting. He's been working 18-hour days trying to find alternative funding, but Phillips has been blocking every effort. The man seems to take pleasure in watching good people fail. George's jaw had tightened at the mention of Phillips. Well, Dr. Chen, I think it's time Mr. Phillips learned what it means to be on the wrong side of a fight that matters. The concert was scheduled for Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after George's appointment with Dr. Ramirez. The official story was that a special presentation would be held in the hospital auditorium for patients and their families. Dr. Ramirez had been asked to attend as the guest of honor, but he had no idea why. As Friday morning arrived, George found himself more nervous than he had been before some of his biggest concerts. This wasn't about entertaining thousands of screaming fans. This was about changing lives, about proving that music could be a force for healing and hope. Dr. Ramirez had spent the morning making the phone calls he had been dreading. One by one, he had to tell families that their children's treatments would be discontinued. Each conversation felt like a knife to his heart, but none was more difficult than the call he made to Maria Santos's mother. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Santos," he said, his voice breaking as he spoke in Spanish. "The hospital has decided to end the program. I've been trying to find other options, but..." The silence on the other end of the phone was devastating. Finally, Mrs. Santos spoke, her voice steady despite the tears he could hear in her words. "Doctor, you have given us hope when we had none. You have treated Maria like she was your own, a daughter. We will never forget your kindness." After hanging up the phone, Dr. Ramirez put his head in his hands and wept. He had failed them all. Despite his best efforts, despite his promises, he had failed the children who needed him most. At exactly 2 o'clock, Dr. Patricia Williams knocked on his office door. "Michael, you need to come with me. Dr. Chen wants to see you in the auditorium." Dr. Ramirez looked up, his eyes red from crying. "Patricia, I can't deal with any more administrative meetings today. I've just spent the morning destroying children's lives. I don't have the strength for whatever speech Phillips wants to give about fiscal responsibility. Michael, trust me, you need to be there." Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. Patricia was trying to hide a smile which seemed completely inappropriate given the circumstances. "What's going on? Just come with me, please." Dr. Ramirez reluctantly followed Patricia through the hospital corridors. As they approached the auditorium, he could hear voices and what sounded like people moving equipment. "Patricia, what is this?" She opened the door to the auditorium, and Dr. Ramirez stopped in his tracks. The room was filled with patients and their families, hospital staff, and sound technicians setting up equipment on the stage. At the center of it all stood George STRAIT, wearing jeans and a black shirt, tuning his guitar. "What? What is this?" Dr. Ramirez whispered. George looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and George smiled. "Dr. Ramirez, I told you I'd never forget what you shared with me. I also told you that some things matter more than profit margins." Dr. Ramirez felt his knees go weak. "Mr. STRAIT, I don't understand." "You will," George said, adjusting his guitar strap. "But first, I have a song to play for a very special audience." As George stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. Dr. Ramirez found himself guided to a chair, in the front row, surrounded by the families he had just been forced to disappoint. Maria Santos was there with her mother, her face pale, but her eyes bright with curiosity. Other children he recognized from the oncology ward were scattered throughout the audience, some in wheelchairs, others sitting with their parents. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space, "I'm here today because of a conversation I had with a very special doctor. A doctor who has dedicated his life to saving children, not because it's profitable, but because it's right." Dr. Ramirez felt tears streaming down his face as George continued. "Sometimes we think success is measured in dollars and cents, in profit margins and budget reports. But real success is measured in lives saved, in hope restored, in promises kept. Today I'm here to make a promise to Dr. Michael Ramirez and to every family in this room." George's fingers found the opening chords of "I Cross My Heart," and the room seemed to hold its breath. This song saved a life 26 years ago. Today, it's going to save many more. As the familiar melody filled the auditorium, Dr. Ramirez closed his eyes and was transported back to that night on Highway 91. But this time, instead of a scared 16-year-old boy listening to a radio in a broken-down truck, he was surrounded by the children he had dedicated his life to saving, and the man whose music had given him the strength to save them was standing right in front of him. But George Strait wasn't finished. As the song ended, he set down his guitar and walked to the edge of the stage. "Dr. Ramirez, would you please join me up here?" On shaking legs, Dr. Ramirez stood and walked to the stage. George helped him up and handed him the microphone. "Tell them," George said quietly, "tell them why you became a doctor." Dr. Ramirez looked out at the sea of faces, patients, families, colleagues and staff members who had become his extended family over the years. "I became a doctor because someone showed me that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope, that even when everything seems lost, there's always a reason to keep fighting." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Every child in this room has taught me something about courage, about strength, about the power of hope. You have all made me a better doctor and a better man." George took the microphone back. "And that's why I'm here today to announce the creation of the Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation. This foundation will not only save the current program, but will expand it to serve 3 additional hospitals across Texas." The auditorium erupted in cheers and applause. Dr. Ramirez stared at George in shock, unable to process what he was hearing. "Mr. Strait, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," George replied. "But there's one more thing. I told you that real success is measured in lives saved and promises kept. Well, I have one more promise to fulfill." George gestured toward the back of the auditorium where the doors were opening. "Dr. Ramirez, there's someone here who has been looking for you for a very long time." The crowd turned to look as a woman in her late 30s walked slowly down the aisle. She had dark hair and the same warm brown eyes as Dr. Ramirez. She was crying but smiling through her tears. Dr. Ramirez's hand flew to his mouth. "Sophia?" he whispered. "Miguel," she replied, using the name she had called him as a child. "I never stopped looking for you." The reunion that followed left not a dry eye in the auditorium. Brother and sister embraced for the first time in 26 years, their tears mixing with the tears of everyone who witnessed the moment. The sound of their sobs echoed through the room, but they were tears of joy, tears of healing, tears of a family finally made whole. As the siblings held each other, George Strait stepped back and watched the miracle he had helped create. This was what real success looked like. Not platinum records or sold-out arenas, but lives transformed, families reunited, and hope restored to those who needed it most. But in the back of the auditorium, Administrator Phillips stood watching the scene with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had been caught completely off guard by George's intervention, and he was already calculating how he could spin this situation to his advantage. What Phillips didn't realize was that George Strait had planned for this moment too, and the biggest confrontation of all was yet to come. As the emotional reunion between Dr. Ramirez and his sister Sophia began to settle, George Strait stepped back to the microphone. The auditorium was still filled with the sounds of crying, but they were tears of joy, tears of healing, tears of hope restored. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, and it would change the way people thought about the power of standing up for what's right. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice carrying a new edge that those who knew him well recognized as his no-nonsense tone. "Before we celebrate this miracle, there's something else that needs to be addressed. Something that almost prevented this moment from ever happening." The crowd began to quiet down, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Dr. Ramirez and Sophia, still holding hands, looked up at George with curiosity. They had no idea that the country music legend was about to deliver a moment of justice that would echo far beyond the walls of that hospital auditorium. You see, There's a man in this room who believed that children's lives could be measured in dollars and cents. A man who thought that saving kids with cancer was less important than padding his own salary and bonus package. George's eyes scanned the crowd until they found Administrator Phillips, who was slowly trying to back toward the exit. "Mr. Phillips, would you please join us up here?" The auditorium fell silent. Phillips froze in his tracks, his face turning pale as hundreds of eyes turned to look at him. He had been caught completely off guard, and for the first time in his career, he found himself in a situation he couldn't control or manipulate. I don't think this is appropriate," Phillips stammered, his voice barely audible over the sound system. "Oh, but I think it is," George replied, his tone steady but firm. "You see, folks, Mr. Phillips here has been systematically destroying programs that help the most vulnerable patients in this hospital. Not because these programs don't work, but because they don't generate enough profit for his liking." Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the chief of staff, stood up from her seat in the middle of the auditorium. Her face was flushed with anger, and she looked like she had been waiting for this moment for months. "Mr. STRAIT is absolutely right. Mr. Phillips has been cutting vital patient care programs while increasing administrative salaries by 12% this year alone." The murmur that ran through the crowd was electric. Parents who had been struggling to pay for their children's treatments, medical staff who had been forced to watch good programs disappear, and community members who had heard rumors but never had proof. They were all beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening. George pulled out a folder from behind his guitar case. "Mr. Phillips, I had some very talented people do some research on your background. Would you like to tell everyone here about your track record at the 3 hospitals you worked at before?" "Coming to Memorial?" Philip's face went from pale to red. "This is harassment. This is defamation. I'm calling my lawyer." "Please do," George said calmly, "because everything I'm about to share is part of the public record. You see, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Phillips has a very specific pattern. He goes to hospitals, cuts programs that serve poor and uninsured patients, collects bonuses for improving efficiency, and then moves on to the next hospital before the human cost of his decisions becomes apparent." The crowd was getting restless. Parents were starting to stand up, their faces showing the anger that comes from realizing they had been manipulated and deceived. Hospital staff members were nodding their heads, finally understanding why so many good programs had been eliminated over the past 2 years. "At St. Mary's Hospital in Houston," George continued, reading from his folder, "you cut the indigent care program that served over 300 families. At Dallas Presbyterian, you eliminated the community health outreach program that provided free screenings to low-income neighborhoods. And at Austin General, you shut down the mental health crisis intervention program that had been preventing suicides for over a decade." Phillips was now visibly shaking. "This is a private matter. This should be handled through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Dr. Chen stood up again, her voice rising with indignation. "You mean the same proper channels you've been using to block every attempt to save these programs? The same proper channels that somehow always end up benefiting you financially?" George handed the microphone to Dr. Chen, who had clearly been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Phillips, I've been documenting your decisions for the past 18 months. Every program you've cut, every family you've turned away, every dollar. You've redirected from patient care to administrative costs. I've been waiting for the right moment to expose what you've been doing to this hospital." The auditorium erupted in angry shouts and applause. Parents were calling out their own experiences with being denied care. Nurses were sharing stories of programs that had been eliminated, and community members were expressing their outrage at what they were learning. But George STRAIT wasn't finished. As the crowd began to settle down, he took back the microphone and delivered what would become the most quoted speech of his career. "You know, Mr. Phillips, I've been in the music business for over 5 decades. I've seen a lot of people who measure success by the size of their bank accounts, the number of awards on their walls, or the power they wield over others. But I've learned something important over the years. Real success isn't about what you accumulate for yourself. It's about what you give to others. His voice grew stronger as he continued. This doctor right here, he pointed to Dr. Ramirez, has dedicated his life to saving children. Not because it makes him rich, but because it's the right thing to do. These nurses and medical staff work double shifts and fight for every dollar they can get for their patients, not because they're getting bonuses, but because they care about human beings. The crowd was hanging on every word George had commanded, the attention of millions of fans over the years. But this moment felt different. This wasn't entertainment. This was a call to action. But you, Mr. Phillips, you've been measuring success by how much money you can squeeze out of sick children and desperate families. You've been treating human suffering like a line item on a budget spreadsheet. Well, let me tell you something about real success. It's not about profit margins. It's about the lives you save, the hope you restore, and the difference you make in the world. Phillips finally found his voice. You can't just come in here and destroy my career based on allegations and rumors. I've done nothing illegal. I've been hired to make this hospital financially viable. Financially viable. George's voice rose with controlled anger. Is that what you call turning away sick children? Is that what you call destroying programs that save lives? Mr. Phillips, you've been making this hospital financially viable by sacrificing the very people it was built to serve. Dr. Ramirez, who had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding, finally spoke up. Mr. Phillips, I want you to look at these families, look at these children. Every program you've cut, every dollar you've redirected, every decision you've made has had a face. These are real people with real needs, not numbers on a spreadsheet. The confrontation was being recorded by multiple people in the audience, and within minutes, videos were being uploaded to social media. The hashtag #MarshRealSuccess was already trending, and news outlets across the country were picking up the story of the country music legend who had stood up to a hospital administrator on behalf of sick children. As the crowd began to disperse, Phillips found himself surrounded by angry parents and hospital staff. His career at Memorial Hospital was over, but more importantly, the exposure of his methods would make it difficult for him to find another position where he could continue his pattern of cutting patient care programs. George STRAIT had achieved something remarkable. He had not only saved Dr. Ramirez's program and reunited him with his sister, but he had also exposed a system that put profits ahead of people. The king of country music had used his platform to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and in doing so, he had redefined what it meant to be successful. Within hours of the confrontation, videos of George STRAIT's speech were being shared millions of times across social media platforms. The hashtag #RealSuccess was trending nationwide, and people from all walks of life were sharing their own stories of being failed by healthcare administrators who prioritize profits over patients. Dr. Ramirez found himself overwhelmed by the response. His phone was ringing constantly with calls from other doctors who had faced similar situations, from parents whose children had been denied care, and from reporters who wanted to hear more about his story. I never wanted to be famous, he told his sister Sophia, as they sat in his office late that evening, watching the news coverage on his computer. I just wanted to help sick kids. Sophia squeezed his hand. Miguel, you've been helping sick kids for 15 years. Now you're helping them on a scale you never imagined possible. You've started something that's going to save children all across the country. The media coverage was unprecedented. Major news networks were running segments about the confrontation, and investigative journalists were digging into the backgrounds of hospital administrators nationwide, looking for patterns of cutting, patient care programs while increasing administrative salaries. George Strait found himself in an unexpected role as a champion for healthcare reform. "I've been blessed with a platform that reaches millions of people," he told reporters. "If I can use that platform to help sick children get the care they need, then that's what I'm going to do. This isn't about politics or publicity. It's about doing what's right." The Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation was receiving donations from across the country. Within 48 hours, the foundation had raised over $2 million, far exceeding the amount needed to save and expand the Pediatric Oncology Assistance Program. But perhaps the most significant impact was the wave of accountability sweeping through hospitals nationwide. The exposure of Phillips' methods had created a domino effect, with hospital boards across the country beginning to scrutinize their own administrative practices. Several hospital administrators resigned or were terminated as investigations revealed similar patterns. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was promoted to Chief Administrator of Memorial Hospital, replacing Phillips, who had been terminated immediately following the confrontation. One of her first acts was to restore all the patient care programs that had been eliminated over the past 2 years. George Strait didn't just save one program, Dr. Chen told reporters. He saved the soul of this hospital. He reminded us why we became healthcare professionals in the first place, to heal people, not to make money off their suffering. The story had captured the imagination of the American public because it represented something that resonated with everyone. The idea that one person, using their influence for good, could make a difference in the lives of countless others. It was a story about courage, about standing up to bullies, and about the power of using your platform to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As the week progressed, the impact continued to grow. Congress announced hearings on hospital administrative practices, state governments began investigating healthcare systems, and medical schools started incorporating ethics courses focused on patient advocacy versus profit maximization. But for Dr. Ramirez, the most important impact was much simpler. He was back to doing what he loved, saving children's lives. And now, thanks to the foundation and the national attention, he had more resources than ever to help the kids who needed him most. Maria Santos, the 8-year-old girl whose treatment had been threatened by the program cuts, was one of the first patients to benefit from the expanded program. Her mother approached Dr. Ramirez in the hospital corridor, tears streaming down her face. "Doctor, I don't know how to thank you," she said in Spanish, "not just for saving Maria's life, but for fighting for all of us. You could have just accepted what they told you, but you didn't give up." Dr. Ramirez knelt down to Maria's level. "You know what, Maria? I learned something very important this week. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth. And the truth is that every child deserves a chance to get well, no matter how much money their family has." No, the transformation was complete. What had started as a routine medical appointment had become a national movement, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, and a reminder that real success isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in lives saved and hope restored. As the 4th week of this incredible journey came to an end, everyone knew that the final chapter would bring even more surprises and inspiration that would touch hearts across the entire nation. 6 months had passed since that historic afternoon in the hospital auditorium, and the impact of George Strait's intervention had grown beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation had expanded to serve 12 hospitals across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, and the program had already saved the lives of over 50 children who would not have received treatment otherwise. Dr. Michael Ramirez stood in his office, looking out at the bustling children's wing that had been transformed since that fateful day. Where once there had been empty beds and cancelled appointments, now there was a constant stream of young patients receiving the care they desperately needed. The walls were covered with drawings and thank you letters from children and families whose lives had been changed by the foundation. Dr. Ramirez, his assistant, Patricia Williams, knocked on his door. "You have a phone call. It's George STRAIT." Even after all these months, hearing that name still sent a thrill through him. The country music legend had become not just a benefactor, but a true friend. They spoke regularly, and George had visited the hospital several times to meet with patients and families. "Hello, George," Dr. Ramirez said as he picked up the phone. "Michael, my friend, I hope you're sitting down because I have some news that's going to change your life again." George's voice was filled with excitement. "I want you to be my guest at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo next month. I'm headlining the final night, and I want you to join me on stage." Dr. Ramirez felt his heart skip a beat. The Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo was one of the biggest events in Texas, drawing over 70,000 people to the NRG Stadium. "George, I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Michael. I want the world to see what real success looks like. I want to tell them about the 53 children who are alive today because of your program. I want to show them that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on stages or in boardrooms, but in hospital rooms and examination offices." The number 53 hit Dr. Ramirez like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the day-to-day work of saving lives that he hadn't fully processed the magnitude of what had been accomplished. 53 children who'd been given a second chance at life. 53 families who'd been spared the unthinkable loss of a child. "I'll be there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good. And Michael, bring Sophia. She's been part of this journey from the beginning, and she deserves to see how far we've all come." As Dr. Ramirez hung up the phone, he couldn't help but think about the incredible chain of events that had brought him to this moment. If he had never found the courage to tell George STRAIT about that night on Highway 91, if George had never decided to investigate Administrator Phillips, if they had never taken that stand against a system that put profits over people, none of this would have happened. The weeks leading up to the Houston Rodeo passed in a blur of excitement and preparation. The foundation had received national attention, and Dr. Ramirez found himself invited to speak at medical conferences and policy forums across the country. He had become an unlikely spokesman for healthcare reform, but he never lost sight of his primary mission, saving children's lives. The night of the concert arrived with all the fanfare and excitement that surrounded George STRAIT's performances. Dr. Ramirez and Sophia sat in the VIP section, watching as 70,000 people filled the massive stadium. The energy was electric, and the crowd roared with approval as George took the stage. For the first hour, it was pure country music magic. George performed his greatest hits, and the audience sang along to every word. But as the concert neared its end, something special was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice carrying easily through the stadium's sound system, "before I close tonight's show, I want to share a story with you. It's a story about a doctor who saved my life without ever knowing it, and how that same doctor is now saving children's lives across our great state of Texas." The crowd quieted down, sensing that something important was about to unfold. George began to tell the story of his visit to Memorial Hospital, of Dr. Ramirez's revelation about how "I Cross My Heart" had saved his life, and of the pediatric oncology program that had been threatened by budget cuts. "That doctor, Dr. Michael Ramirez, is here with us tonight," George continued, "and I want you to meet the man who has dedicated his life to saving children. Dr. Ramirez, would you please join me on stage?" Dr. Ramirez felt the same nervous excitement he had experienced in the hospital auditorium, but this time it was magnified by the sheer scale of the venue. As he walked onto the stage, 70,000 people rose to their feet in thunderous Applause. The sound was deafening, and he was momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. George handed him the microphone, and Dr. Ramirez looked out at the sea of faces stretching as far as he could see. "When I was 16 years old," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I was ready to give up on life. I was sitting on the side of a highway planning to end my own story when George Strait's voice came through my radio and reminded me that there was still hope in the world." The stadium was silent now, hanging on every word. That night, I made a promise to myself that I would dedicate my life to helping others the way George's music had helped me. I became a doctor, and for 15 years I've been working to save children with cancer. But 6 months ago, I almost lost everything when hospital administrators decided that profit margins were more important than children's lives. The crowd began to murmur with anger and sympathy. "George Strait didn't just save my program," Dr. Ramirez continued. "He saved the lives of 53 children who are alive today because they received treatment through the Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation. 53 families who still have their sons and daughters, their brothers and sisters, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren." The applause was thunderous, but Dr. Ramirez wasn't finished. "But more than that, George showed the world what real success looks like. It's not about how much money you make or how famous you become. It's about the lives you touch, the hope you restore, and the difference you make in the world. Every child who beats cancer, every family that gets to stay together, every doctor who finds the courage to fight for what's right, that's real success." George took back the microphone, and the crowd could see tears in his eyes. "Dr. Ramirez, you've taught me more about success than 50 years in the music business ever could. You've shown me that the most important stage isn't in an arena or a stadium. It's in a hospital room where a child's life hangs in the balance." He turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that every ticket sold for tonight's concert, every dollar raised, is going directly to the Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation. Together, we're going to save even more children's lives." The stadium erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to go on forever. Dr. Ramirez looked out at the crowd and thought about Maria Santos, who was now in remission and back to playing with her stuffed elephant. He thought about the dozens of other children who had received treatment through the foundation, and the hundreds more who would be helped in the years to come. As the applause finally began to die down, George stepped back to the microphone. "One last time. You know, when I wrote 'I Cross My Heart' all those years ago, I never imagined that it would save a life. But now I know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is share your story, stand up for what's right, and use whatever platform you have to help others." He strummed his guitar and began to play the opening chords of the song that had started it all. As his voice filled the stadium, Dr. Ramirez closed his eyes and was transported back to that night on Highway 91. But this time, instead of a scared 16-year-old boy listening to a radio in a broken-down truck, he was surrounded by 70,000 people who were celebrating the power of hope, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the incredible impact that one person can have on the world. As the song ended, George and Dr. Ramirez stood together on the stage, looking out at the crowd that was on its feet, cheering and crying and celebrating. Sophia watched from the audience, tears streaming down her face as she saw her brother, the boy who had run away from home in despair, standing on one of the biggest stages in the world, being celebrated for his courage and compassion. In the months that followed, the impact of that night continued to grow. The Houston Rodeo concert raised over $2 million for the foundation, and the video of Dr. Ramirez's speech went viral, inspiring similar programs in hospitals across the country. Medical schools began teaching courses on patient advocacy, and hospital administrators found themselves under increased scrutiny from boards and communities who demanded that patient care be prioritized over profit margins. Dr. Ramirez returned to his work at Memorial Hospital, but he was no longer the quiet, behind-the-scenes doctor who had once struggled to save his program. He had become a national figure, a symbol of what it meant to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He testified before Congress about healthcare reform, spoke at medical conferences about the importance of patient advocacy, and continued to save children's lives one patient at a time. The Michael Ramirez Children's Hope Foundation continued to expand, eventually serving hospitals in 15 states and saving hundreds of children's lives. Dr. Ramirez and Sophia remained close, meeting regularly to share stories and memories of their incredible journey. And George STRAIT, he continued to make music, but he also became one of the most vocal advocates for healthcare reform in the country, using his platform to fight for policies that put patients before profits. Years later, when people asked Dr. Ramirez about the secret to his success, he would always give the same answer. Real success isn't about what you accumulate for yourself. It's about what you give to others. It's about the lives you save, the hope you restore, and the difference you make in the world. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and stand up for what's right. The story of Dr. Michael Ramirez and George STRAIT became a legend, told and retold in medical schools and hospitals across the country. It was a story about the power of music to heal, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the incredible impact that one person can have when they choose to use their platform for good. But most of all, it was a story about hope. The hope that had saved a 16-year-old boy on a highway in Texas, and the hope that continued to save children's lives every single day.